It began with a letter, not an email, not a phone call, but an old-fashioned, wax-sealed envelope that appeared in the mailbox with no return address. The parchment smelled faintly of something sweet, almost rotten, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. The ink, deep and glossy, spelled out a name, the protagonist's name, but in a handwriting they did not recognize. The invitation was short, eerily direct. You are expected at Blackwood House. Midnight. Do not be late. At first, the letter was dismissed as a prank, a strange relic from another time sent by some eccentric stranger. But curiosity has a way of wearing down skepticism, and by the time the moon hung high in the sky, the protagonists found themselves standing before the infamous mansion. Blackwood House had long been a local mystery, whispered about by those who dared approach it. It was said to be abandoned for decades, yet on certain nights, lights flickered in the windows as if someone, or something, was home. The wrought iron gate stood ajar, its rusted hinges groaning against the night wind. Beyond it, the path was swallowed by gnarled roots, the once grand driveway, now a twisting maze of neglect. The house loomed at the end of the path, a Victorian relic draped in shadows. Ivy strangled its walls, and its windows, though intact, reflected nothing but blackness, as if they peered into something deeper than mere darkness. The front door, enormous and carved with grotesque faces, swung open with an unsettling ease, as though the house had been waiting. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and something damp, something that did not belong in a home, but in a grave. The grand foyer stretched out before them, its checkered marble floor dulled with time, the chandelier above swaying slightly despite the absence of any wind. The silence was not comforting, it was expectant. The letter had said midnight, and by the clock on the far wall, a grotesque thing of dark wood and twisted metal, it was exactly that. The second hand, instead of ticking forward, jerked and trembled in place, stuck in an eternal hesitation. The house was aware of their presence. Footsteps echoed from upstairs. Slow, deliberate. A presence unseen, yet unmistakable. The protagonist's breath hitched, but their body remained still, as if caught between instinct and the undeniable pull of something unseen. A shadow passed at the top of the staircase. Something tall, human-shaped but somehow wrong. The shape lingered, observing before melting back into the corridor. A chill settled deep in their bones, but turning back was not an option. Something about the house made the very idea of leaving feel irrelevant. As if the moment they had stepped through the threshold, the outside world had ceased to exist. Their fingers brushed against the letter in their pocket. A reminder that they had come here for a reason. But whose reason? Theirs or the house's? A grandfather clock in the hallway let out a soft, wheezing chime, though it did not mark any particular hour. The sound carried through the walls, distorting as it traveled, turning into something almost like laughter, almost like whispers. The house was old, but it was not empty. It had been waiting, and now it was time to begin. There was something fundamentally wrong with Blackwood House, though the realization was slow, creeping in like a shadow stretching across a room. The protagonist had expected dust and decay, the stagnant air of an abandoned home left to be swallowed by time. But inside, the house felt lived in, not merely occupied but curated, as though unseen hands had been tending to its every detail for centuries. The wooden floors bore no dust, no signs of neglect. The portraits lining the hallway, their gilded frames polished to a mirror-like sheen, depicted faces frozen in expressions too knowing, too alive. The protagonist's footsteps barely made a sound, swallowed by the heavy air that seemed to absorb all movement. It was not silence they walked through, but something else, something dense, watchful. The walls pressed inward, not literally, but in the way they seemed too close, as if the house had been designed to fold in on its inhabitants, to keep them inside. The air smelled strange, metallic yet sweet, like old coins soaked in perfume. A grand staircase curved toward the upper floors, its steps dark with age but sturdy. The figure they had glimpsed moments ago was gone, leaving behind only the faintest disturbance in the dust motes swirling in the dim candlelight. The protagonists swallowed hard, an inexplicable certainty taking root. They had not imagined the figure. Something else was here, something that had been waiting long before they arrived. They pressed forward. There was no clear destination, only a pull, an invisible tether that drew them deeper into the mansion. Doors lined the hallway, each identical in their deep mahogany hue, their brass handles gleaming despite the darkness. The protagonist reached for the nearest one, hesitated, then turned the knob. The room beyond was a parlor, but something about it was wrong. It was too perfect, as if it had been frozen in time rather than abandoned. A fireplace crackled despite no one having lit it, its embers smoldering with a sickly blue glow. A phonograph sat on a small wooden table, its needle resting against an unmoving record, waiting. The protagonist stepped inside, the air shifting as if acknowledging their presence. They ran a hand over the back of a velvet armchair, and that was when they saw it, a teacup sitting on the table, filled to the brim with steaming liquid. The porcelain was fine, delicate, untouched by dust or time. But what sent ice through their veins was the indentation on the chair's cushion, as though someone had just been sitting there moments ago. A voice, distant yet clear, whispered through the room. Not a sound carried on the air, but something closer, something inside the protagonist's mind. Sit. The word was gentle, almost polite, but it was not a suggestion. It was a command. The protagonist stepped back, heart pounding. The phonograph needle dropped on its own, the record spinning without touch, crackling to life with an old melody that felt wrong. Warped, reversed, something not meant to be played. Then, a shape stirred in the chair. It was subtle at first, as if the very fabric of reality was reconsidering what belonged and what did not. The indentation deepened, the cushion shifting under unseen weight. A whisper of movement, a suggestion of something unseen just on the edge of perception. The protagonist did not wait to see more. They turned and fled, the door slamming shut behind them with a force that rattled the very walls. The house was alive, and it was not content to merely exist. It wanted something, and it was only just beginning. The protagonist stood in the hallway, breathless, heart hammering against their ribs like a caged animal. The door to the parlor remained shut, its surface smooth and unyielding, as if nothing unnatural had just occurred within its walls. But they knew better. Something had moved in that chair. Something unseen, something waiting. And the phonograph, the way it had played on its own, warping the melody into something grotesque, as if the house itself was trying to communicate. They turned, determined to find a way out. The letter had said midnight, but it had not said how long they were expected to stay. The front door was the obvious choice. Leave now, forget the invitation ever came, and never speak of this place again. But as they retraced their steps toward the grand foyer, they found the hallway had changed. The one straight corridor seemed to stretch, distorting like a funhouse mirror. The doors, which had lined both sides in perfect symmetry, had multiplied. There were more now, too many, identical and featureless, extending into the dim, candlelit abyss ahead. The air grew colder, thick with a silence that felt conscious, as though it was not an absence of sound, but the house itself holding its breath, waiting to see what they would do next. They moved toward where they believed the front door had been, but the walls felt unfamiliar, the paintings different, no longer the same eerie but static portraits, but rather new ones that had not been there before. Faces twisted in expressions of silent horror. Some seemed to watch, their painted eyes following every step. A door stood ahead, grander than the rest, adorned with intricate carvings that almost pulsed in the flickering light. This had to be it, the way out. They grasped the handle and turned. It wouldn't budge. Panic flared in their chest. They pulled harder, yanked with both hands. The brass was warm under their fingertips, too warm, as if someone had just been holding it from the other side. They took a step back, glancing around for another exit when, slam, one of the doors further down the hallway burst open. The sound echoed through the mansion like a gunshot, reverberating down the endless corridor. But the room beyond was not empty. The light barely reached inside, but it was enough to see movement, a shadow shifting just beyond the threshold, not stepping out, not revealing itself fully, just waiting. A shape, tall, thin, wrong, lingered in the doorway. It didn't move like a person. It swayed, jittered, as if reality struggled to contain it. A whisper slithered through the air, just at the edge of hearing. A voice, or perhaps many voices, speaking at once but saying nothing. The protagonist took a step back. The shape lurched, not forward, not fully, just enough to acknowledge them. The doors to either side of the hallway creaked, as if something behind them had begun to wake up. The protagonist turned and ran. They didn't care where the next door led, only that it was away. Their fingers fumbled over a handle, twisting it open, throwing themselves inside. Click! The door locked itself behind them. The darkness was immediate. The room held no windows, no candles, no firelight. Only blackness, deep and consuming. And then, from that suffocating void, something breathed. The darkness swallowed everything. It was not the kind of darkness that came with the night, where the eyes could adjust and outlines would take shape. No, this was a hungry darkness, absolute and smothering, as though light had never existed in this place. The protagonist stood frozen, every breath loud in the suffocating silence. The only thing they could hear, aside from the frantic thudding of their own heart, was the sound of breathing. It was not their own. A slow, deliberate inhale, a pause, then an exhale, heavy and wet, as if something was too close. They took a cautious step backward, pressing against the door that had locked behind them. Their fingers scrambled for the handle, twisting, pulling, nothing. It was as if the lock had melted into the wood, denying them escape. Then, from the depths of the room, something shifted. The breathing stopped, and for a moment, the air was dead. Then came a different sound, a scrape like nails dragging along wood. It was methodical, rhythmic, counting. Scrape. 1. Scrape. 2. Scrape. 3. They didn't want to know what would happen when it finished. Their hands fumbled along the walls, searching for anything. A lamp, a switch, even a match. But the walls were smooth, unnervingly so. No furniture, no paintings, no dust. Just emptiness, as though the room had been built for a single purpose, to trap. Scrape. 4. Then the air changed. A presence, not warm, not cold, but aware, filled the space beside them. The protagonist did not dare move. The breathing returned, this time right next to their ear. With a rush of adrenaline, they stumbled forward, away from the unseen thing, their hands still scrambling along the walls. Then suddenly fabric. A curtain? No, a tapestry. The texture was thick beneath their fingers, old but intact. And behind it, something solid. A seam in the wall. Scrape. 5. They didn't hesitate. With all their strength, they tore at the fabric, ripping it down in one desperate motion. Dust filled the air, and with it, something else light. A thin, unnatural glow spilled from the revealed space behind the tapestry, casting flickering shadows against the walls. There was a door. Not wood. Metal. The kind that shouldn't belong in an old Victorian mansion. Behind them, the breathing stopped again. But this time, it was not silent. The floor groaned as something moved toward them, slow, deliberate. They reached for the metal door, found the handle. It turned. They threw themselves through the opening, slamming it shut behind them. A moment later, a single, sharp knock landed on the other side. Not pounding, not scratching, just one knock, as if whatever was inside knew they would be back. They turned to see where they had escaped to, and what they saw made their breath catch in their throat. It was not another hallway, not another room. It was a staircase leading down, and on the wall beside it, written in something too dark and too thick to be ink, was a single word. Remember. The protagonist stood frozen at the top of the staircase, the word remember glaring at them from the wall. The letters glistened under the dim, unnatural glow of the passageway, as if the ink, or blood, was still fresh. The air down below felt wrong, thick and weighted, pressing against their chest like an unseen force. And yet, something inside them stirred. A memory, hazy and incomplete, like a dream just before waking. The feeling was not new. It was familiar. That realization sent a fresh wave of fear through their body. Had they been here before? A deep creak echoed through the narrow space, the sound of wood stretching and shifting. It was followed by a distant knock, then another. Somewhere in the house, doors were moving, but none of them had touched a thing. They had no choice. The hallway behind them was sealed. The only way out was down. Each step was slow, deliberate, though the air smelled increasingly foul the further they descended. Damp like rotting wood. The walls had changed too. No longer ornate Victorian design, but rough, uneven stone, ancient, like a place built before the mansion itself existed. The steps ended in front of another door. Unlike the others, this one was different. Iron, rusted but strong, with a heavy latch instead of a knob. It looked like it belonged in a prison, or a crypt. The protagonist hesitated. The silence around them was unbearable. Every breath they took felt loud, violating the stillness, as if the house was listening. Then from beyond the iron door a sound, whispering, not just one voice, but many, overlapping in a chorus of broken murmurs. Some pleading, some laughing, some weeping, and in the middle of them all, one voice that stood out, one that said their name. The protagonist's stomach lurched. Their name, spoken as if it belonged here. The latch was ice cold under their fingers, but they pulled it anyway. The door groaned open, revealing a long, narrow corridor lined with mirrors. Dozens of them, stretching into the darkness. The reflection in each was wrong, some showing the hallway behind them, some showing nothing at all. And then, in one of the nearest mirrors, they saw something impossible. Themselves, but not as they were now. The reflection was older, dressed differently, a different time, a different life. Their mirrored self stared back, eyes filled with something terrible, something they did not understand. Then, the reflection slowly raised a hand and pointed down the corridor. The protagonist turned. The hallway extended endlessly, lined with more mirrors, more distorted reflections. But at the very end, barely visible in the dim glow, stood a figure. No face, no features, just a shadow waiting. And behind them a voice, no longer a whisper, no longer distant. You were never supposed to leave. The protagonist felt their body go rigid, because deep down, beneath all the fear, beneath all the confusion, they knew it was true. They had been here before, and they had forgotten. The weight of the revelation pressed down on the protagonist's chest like an iron hand. They had been here before, but when? And why couldn't they remember? The corridor of mirrors stretched before them, warping their reflection into grotesque distortions of themselves. Some too tall, others too thin, some with faces that didn't match their own. Some didn't have faces at all. The figure at the end of the hall remained motionless, a shadow that did not belong. It stood as though it had been waiting for them, its presence patient, inevitable. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door behind them had sealed shut, the rusted iron latch now fused as if it had never been meant to open again. They took a step forward. The air thickened. The whispers from the mirrors grew louder. The reflection closest to them moved, but they hadn't. They froze, eyes locked on the glass, watching as their own mirrored self tilted its head, studying them with an expression they weren't making. Then it smiled, not a normal smile, too wide, too knowing. The protagonist staggered backward, but their reflection did not. It leaned closer, pressing its palm against the inside of the mirror. A thin crack formed under its touch, branching outward like veins. And then, ever so softly, it spoke. "You left us behind." A cold rush of terror shot through them. Their mind raced. Was it talking about the house? The voices? The shadow at the end of the hall? Before they could react, more cracks spidered across the glass, not just in this mirror, but in all of them. The distorted versions of themselves and the reflections began to move independently, their eyes tracking the protagonist with something hungry in their gaze. The glass began to shatter. Piece by piece, fragments of themselves peeled away, falling onto the floor with a sound that was both sharp and wet. But the figures inside the mirrors did not disappear. They stepped forward, emerging from the breaking glass like something crawling out of water, their movements unnatural, wrong. And the shadow at the end of the hall? It had started moving too. The protagonist turned and ran. Their footsteps echoed chaotically, overlapping with the hissing whispers and the crunch of broken glass underfoot. The hallway twisted as they ran, its walls shifting, elongating, as if the house itself was warping reality around them. No matter how fast they moved, the mirrors continued beside them, their reflections watching, chasing. Then, up ahead, a door, different from the iron one before. Wooden, old, familiar. They didn't stop to think. They grabbed the handle, twisted. It opened. The protagonist fell through, slamming it shut behind them. Silence followed. They panted, pressing their back against the door, heart hammering in their chest. Slowly, their eyes adjusted to the dim light of the room they had entered. Their stomach dropped. It was a bedroom, and not just any bedroom. Their childhood bedroom. Everything was the same. The old wooden dresser, the tiny bed with the worn-out quilt, the toy chest in the corner. Dust coated every surface, but the air smelled like it always had, faintly of lavender of home. But that was impossible. This house, this mansion, was nowhere near where they had grown up. Then they saw the worst part. The bed was not empty. Someone was lying in it. Their own body, tucked under the blankets, sleeping peacefully. Their chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths. The protagonist stared, unable to move, unable to breathe. And then, as if sensing their presence, the sleeping version of themselves opened its eyes. They were not human eyes, and they were smiling. The protagonist could not move. Their body refused to obey, frozen between disbelief and terror. Their own sleeping form, impossibly present in this decayed mansion, was staring at them, wide-eyed, smiling with teeth that were too sharp, too many. The room felt wrong, the air thick with something unseen, pressing against their skin like invisible hands. The version of themselves beneath the covers began to stir, sitting up slowly, the blankets sliding away like something alive. The smile never faded. "You look tired." The voice was familiar, but warped, like hearing oneself speak underwater. It was their voice, but it did not belong to them. The sleeper tilted its head, mirroring the same unnatural motion the reflections in the mirrors had made. The protagonist stepped backward, instinct screaming at them to flee, but the door behind them was gone. Not locked, not jammed, gone, as if it had never been there. The walls seemed closer now, the room shrinking with each breath. The sleeper rose to its feet, its movements slow but deliberate. It did not blink, did not break eye contact. "You left me here." The words sent a sharp chill through the protagonist's spine. They did not understand. How could they have left themselves behind? The sleeper took a step forward. The protagonist matched it with a step back, but there was nowhere to go. Their back pressed against the wall, the old wallpaper peeling beneath their fingertips. "It's been so long," the sleeper whispered, now just inches away. "You forgot me, but I never forgot you." Its breath was cold, too cold. The scent of dust and something rotten clung to it. The protagonist wanted to scream, to shove it away, but they were frozen, paralyzed by some unseen force. Then the sleeper reached out. Fingers brushed against the protagonist's face, except they did not feel like fingers. The touch was wrong, as though something beneath the skin was shifting, moving. The sensation spread, crawling across their skin like tiny insects burrowing into their pores. Memories flooded their mind. Not memories they remembered, but memories of this house, of this room, of this moment. They had been here before. Not once, many times. Over and over, trapped in this same nightmare, always running, always forgetting. The house never let them leave. It only let them reset. And the sleeper was what they had left behind each time. The part of them that remembered. The part of them that suffered while they forgot. The walls trembled. The furniture melted, distorting into dark, pulsing shapes, like living things gasping for air. The sleeper's grin widened, its teeth stretching too far, its eyes sinking into hollow pits. The protagonist screamed. And then, darkness. Everything collapsed inward, the room, the mansion, the sleeper, all of it folding into nothingness. Silence. And then they woke up, but not in the house, not in the mansion. They woke up outside, standing in front of it, the decayed Victorian structure looming over them under a moonless sky. The front door was wide open, waiting. In their hands, something cold. They looked down, a rusted iron key, and somewhere, deep inside the house, someone whispered their name. The protagonists stood motionless, their breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The rusted iron key in their palm felt heavier than it should, its cold metal burning against their skin like it carried a weight beyond the physical. The house loomed before them, its gaping doorway wide open, an invitation or a trap, or both. They had been inside. They had escaped. Or had they? The memories twisted in their mind, shifting like reflections in cracked glass. The more they tried to grasp the truth, the more it slithered away, just out of reach. A cold wind howled through the dead trees surrounding the mansion, their skeletal branches scraping against the sky like clawed fingers. The whispering voice from inside the house called their name again, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind, except it wasn't. It was familiar. A memory stirred. "You left me here." The sleeper's words echoed in their mind. The sleeper had known them, had waited for them. But why? What did it mean? Had they been in this place before? How many times? They clenched the key tighter. Something deep inside them, some primal instinct, begged them to drop it, to turn and run and never look back. But their fingers wouldn't release it. The key's presence was absolute, like it had always belonged to them. The protagonist took a step forward, then another. The open door yawned wider. As they crossed the threshold, the house exhaled a deep, shuddering breath, as though it had been holding its lungs full of stale air, waiting for them to return. The moment they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them. Darkness swallowed them whole. The temperature dropped instantly, wrapping them in suffocating cold. The hallway ahead was dimly lit by a single, flickering chandelier, its weak glow casting unnatural shadows that moved without cause. The key in their hand pulsed. Slowly, they raised it to their face. There was something carved into the metal. They hadn't noticed it before, but now, in the dim light, they could make out the etching. "Turn back before it remembers." Their pulse thundered in their ears. Before what remembers? Before who remembers? Something creaked above them. The protagonist lifted their gaze toward the second-floor balcony that overlooked the grand foyer. The darkness beyond the railing was thick, impenetrable. But in that moment, something shifted within it. Not a movement, a presence. They knew, without seeing, that something was up there, watching, waiting, remembering. The protagonist forced a breath into their lungs, their grip tightening around the key. The house was different now. Or maybe they had escaped before. But this time, they weren't sure if they would again. The silence inside the mansion was not ordinary silence. It was layered, thick with something listening, something that had waited far too long. The protagonist could feel it pressing against their ears, against their skin, like unseen hands testing the weight of their presence. Their fingers twitched around the rusted key, the words etched into its surface still burning in their mind. "Turn back before it remembers." But turn back where? The door had vanished the moment they stepped inside, sealing them in with whatever waited in the shadows above. The chandeliers dim. Flickering light cast twisted shadows along the walls, making the room feel smaller, the air thinner. The grand staircase stood before them, stretching up into the darkness, the second floor hidden beyond the limits of the feeble glow. Something was up there. They knew it, felt it. A deep creaking sound echoed through the foyer. Not from the stairs, nor the floorboards beneath their feet. It came from the walls. The protagonist turned sharply, their breath hitching. The wallpaper, peeling brittle with age, was shifting, bulging. A slow, grotesque movement, like something unseen was pressing against it from the other side, straining to break through. Then came the whisper, right next to their ear. "You shouldn't have come back." They recoiled, spinning on their heel, expecting to see anyone, standing there. But there was nothing, just empty space and that overwhelming sense of being watched. The chandelier flickered violently. The shadows moved. And then a door creaked open. Not the front door, a different one. Across the foyer, a narrow hallway stretched into the house's depths, and at its end, a door now stood ajar. No light came from within, just endless, gaping black. The protagonist's pulse hammered in their skull. They had two choices, the stairs or the door. Upstairs, the thing was waiting, watching. Behind the door, something had just invited them in. They took a step forward, the key in their hand growing heavier. The house knew them. But worse, it was starting to remember. The door creaked wider as the protagonist approached it. The faint sound of air rushing past their ears like whispers from an unseen crowd. The key in their hand pulsed again, an unnatural rhythm, almost as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, as if the mansion itself were weighing them down, testing their resolve. The hallway beyond was suffocating in its darkness. No light, no warmth, just the oppressive blackness that swallowed everything. The house was silent now, but the air was thick with anticipation, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The protagonist's heart raced. They could feel the echo of the whisper from before, still lingering in the air. You shouldn't have come back. The words seemed to follow them, even though they couldn't be sure whether the voice had come from within their own mind or from somewhere deeper in the house. The key grew colder in their hand. The house wanted them back. At the end of the hallway, the door was barely open, just enough to see a sliver of darkness beyond. Something deep inside the protagonist urged them to turn back, to run, but the house was in their bones now. It wasn't just a place, it was a part of them. They reached out, fingers trembling, and pushed the door the rest of the way open. The air inside was icy, colder than the rest of the house. It felt as though they had crossed into another world, one where time and space no longer obeyed the rules. Inside, there was a chamber, a small, circular room, its walls covered in decayed portraits. The faces of long-dead ancestors stared down at them, eyes lifeless yet somehow filled with sorrow. The smell of mildew and something far worse, decay, clung to the walls, thickening the air. And in the center of the room was a mirror, a full-length mirror, standing alone, framed in dark, tarnished wood. It was out of place here, in this forgotten part of the mansion, its surface perfectly intact. The glass was so clear it seemed unnatural, an almost painful contrast to the deteriorating surroundings. The protagonist was drawn to it, their reflection staring back at them. Yet something was wrong. There was something in their own eyes that felt foreign, a darkness that hadn't been there before, something that lingered in the glass. The heartbeat pulsed again, this time louder. Their own heartbeat, or something else's. The sound was deafening, filling the room with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. They stepped closer, compelled by an unseen force. The mirror seemed to draw them in, its surface rippling as though it were alive. Their reflection began to shift, contorting, moving in ways their own body did not. The dark presence in the glass grinned, its face twisting into a mockery of their own. And then the reflection spoke. It's too late to leave now. The protagonist recoiled, the breath caught in their throat, but the words echoed in their mind, reverberating off the walls of the room. The air felt thick with fear, as if the very house was alive, aware of their every movement. The mirror's reflection grinned wider, impossibly wider, the darkness around it growing, wrapping itself around the protagonist's own image. And then the reflection reached out, not just the figure in the mirror, something else. The room shuddered, as if the walls themselves were quaking. The heartbeat grew louder still. The house was alive, and it wanted them. The protagonist tried to step back, but their feet wouldn't obey. The key in their hand pulsed again, sending a shock of cold through their body. It was calling them, and then, with a sickening lurch, the mirror swallowed them whole. The world flickered and then collapsed into utter darkness. The protagonist's senses were assaulted by the overwhelming cold, like the very marrow of their bones had been turned to ice. Their heart hammered in their chest. Yet in the suffocating stillness, it felt distant, muffled, as if it was not their own. Where am I? They thought, panic rising within their throat. The house was vast, endless, and now it was all around them. But they could not move. Their limbs felt like they were bound, pressed down by some invisible weight, while the house seemed to breathe with them, a silent, living thing that was watching, waiting. The key remained in their hand, yet it felt as if it no longer belonged to them. It had become something else, a tether to a place far beyond their understanding. A voice, soft, indistinct, as if it were coming from behind thick glass, whispered through the darkness. "You were always meant to be here." The words caused a ripple in the air around them, warping everything they could feel. The house seemed to shift, stretching its walls out like rubber, pulling them into a place they had never seen, yet somehow had always known. The darkness began to recede, ever so slowly, pulling back into itself, as if the air were being drawn away by some unseen force. The protagonist's vision blurred, then cleared. They were standing once more, though they were not in the same room anymore. They were deep inside the house now, deeper than before. The stone floors were cold, slick with moisture, as if they were beneath the mansion, beneath everything. The walls were rough-hewn rock, twisted, like they had been carved out of the earth itself. The cellar, maybe? It was darker here, the air thick with the scent of mildew, rot, and something far worse, something that clung to the very stones around them. Something was down here with them. At the far end of the chamber, a faint light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows. The flicker wasn't from a torch or lamp, but from something deeper within the ground. It was as though the very foundation of the mansion was alive, reacting to their presence, alive with the pulse of something ancient and forgotten. A movement in the corner of the room caught their eye. The protagonist spun toward it, their pulse quickening. But it wasn't a person. It was something else. At first, it was just a shape, a blur against the shadows, but as their eyes adjusted, they saw it more clearly. A figure, hunched and twisted, its limbs too long, its body too still, almost as though it were a part of the walls themselves. Its skin was a sickly, translucent gray, sagging loosely over its bones. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a hideous mask of empty sockets and stretched flesh. It wasn't human. It didn't move like a human. It crawled on all fours, dragging its body as though it were one with the earth. The ground seemed to give way under its weight, as if it were melting into the stones. The thing spoke. Its voice was not a voice, but a series of whispers, all layered on top of each other, like 1,000 broken echoes. "You shouldn't have come this far." The protagonist's chest tightened, the weight of its gaze almost suffocating. It wasn't the creature that terrified them. It was the knowledge in its words. This thing, whatever it was, knew them. It knew why they had come. The key in their hand began to burn with cold again, more intense this time, like it was alive with a purpose. The whispers around them grew louder, overwhelming their thoughts. "They're waiting. The ones who came before you." The thing moved forward, its limbs twisting unnaturally, making sickening noises as it slid closer to them. It was too close, too fast. The protagonist couldn't breathe. The weight of its presence was suffocating. But then, just as quickly as it had advanced, it stopped. It tilted its head, its empty sockets seeming to focus on them. And for a moment, the room was filled with an oppressive silence. Then, without warning, the creature slithered back into the shadows, its form dissolving into the darkness as though it had never been there. The key in their hand burned with the urgency of its power, the connection to the house growing stronger by the second. The protagonist knew with absolute certainty, that they were not alone. The house had always known they were coming. The things that had been buried deep within it, forgotten by time, were waking up, responding to their presence. And now, the protagonist was not just trapped in the mansion. They were part of it. They had become one with its darkness, its hunger. Time seemed to collapse as the protagonist stood there, drenched in the shadows of the house. The creature had vanished, yet the air still buzzed with its presence, thick and suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air heavy with the echoes of something ancient. The protagonist's thoughts were tangled, swirling in confusion, but there was one thing they knew with terrifying clarity. They were not just in the mansion anymore. They had entered a realm that existed outside of time, a place where the past and present collided. Every step they took felt unnatural, the floor beneath them squelching as though it were soaked with the remnants of things long forgotten. The key, still clutched tightly in their hand, pulsed in sync with their heartbeat. It was no longer just an object, it was a bridge, a connection to something far darker, far older than they could understand. It was the reason they had come, whether by fate or their own foolishness. And now, it was leading them deeper into the house's twisted heart. The shadows around them seemed to dance in ways that weren't quite natural, bending and flickering like flames in a breeze that didn't exist. The walls appeared to shift, their once solid stone surface now rippling like water, blurring the line between the present and some long-forgotten past. It was as if the house was reassembling itself, rearranging its architecture based on the forgotten lives it had consumed, twisting through centuries of sorrow and death. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by one creature, but by something more insidious, something older. The key in their hands seemed to burn now, as though the mansion itself was trying to force them toward the next step, toward the truth. Suddenly, the walls seemed to split open, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. It was darker here than anywhere else they had been. As they entered, the air grew cooler, and a low hum reverberated in their chest. The feeling of being watched intensified, but this time, it was not just in the shadows. It was as though the house itself was alive, its eyes on them from every angle. They stepped forward into the new space. The passage was not like the others they had walked through. It was a tunnel, underground. The air smelled of earth and rot, a dampness that seemed to permeate their very skin. The floor was uneven, cracked in places, but there was something else. The walls were lined with symbols, ancient markings that looked almost like an old language. The characters were faded and worn, but the meaning was unmistakable, a warning. Yet, the protagonist couldn't stop. Each step brought them closer to something, a truth they hadn't known they were searching for. The walls seemed to move with them, the shadows whispering words that they couldn't quite understand, but still felt deep in their gut. "Welcome home?" The words echoed in their ears, familiar in a way that made their skin crawl. As they walked deeper, the tunnel widened, revealing a cavern-like space at its end. Here, the air was thick, heavy with something ancient and decayed. In the center of the cavern stood a pedestal, and on top of it, covered in grime and dust, was a large, open book. The moment the protagonist laid eyes on it, the key in their hand burned with an intensity that made them gasp. It was as if the house was beckoning them, pulling them toward the book, toward the answers it held. They approached the pedestal slowly, almost reluctantly, the whispers of the house growing louder, swirling around them like a storm. The book seemed to pulse with energy, its pages fluttering as if caught in an invisible wind. As they reached out to touch it, a wave of cold washed over them, and the room seemed to tilt. The words on the pages became clear, but they weren't words at all. The pages were filled with images, each one more horrifying than the last. Faces twisted in agony, monstrous shapes that defied understanding, symbols of cults and rituals lost to time. And in the center of the pages, etched in red, a name, the protagonist's name. They recoiled in horror, but the house was relentless. The key in their hand began to throb, urging them to read the name. It was as if they had always known it. The house had been waiting for them, had been calling them back to it, to this moment. They were part of something much larger than they had ever imagined. This house, this place, had always been their destiny. A clash of memory and reality tore through them. Faces, voices, moments, flashes of a life they did not remember but knew they had once lived. The protagonist stumbled back, gripping their head as memories began to surge. They had been here before. This house was not just a house. It was the very place where everything had started. The bloodlines, the rituals, the dark power that had been passed down through the generations. It was all part of them. And now, they had returned to finish what had been started. The book slammed shut on its own, the force of the motion sending a jolt through the room. The air became thick, and the floor beneath their feet cracked as the walls seemed to shift, closing in on them once more. They had learned too much. The house would not let them leave now. The book had been the catalyst, the moment when the house truly revealed itself as a living, breathing entity. The moment the protagonist touched its pages, something ancient and malevolent stirred deep within the mansion's foundations. As the walls began to close in, squeezing the air from their lungs, the protagonist could feel it, the weight of centuries pressing down upon them. The house was no longer a structure of wood and stone. It had become something else entirely, something far older and far more alive. The protagonist stumbled backward, trying to keep their bearings, but the very ground seemed to shift beneath their feet, throwing them off balance. Their heart raced, the pulsating pressure in their chest matching the rhythm of the unseen force closing in around them. The whispers had become a cacophony now, voices overlapping, murmuring words that sounded like curses and chants, languages they couldn't understand but somehow felt in their bones. The key in their hand burned hotter than ever, scorching their palm, but still, they couldn't let it go. The room began to warp. The stone walls stretched and twisted, blurring the lines between space and time. The floor, once solid and unyielding, now appeared to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. The air grew thick and stale, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had turned against them. The protagonist's breaths came in shallow gasps, each one feeling like it could be their last. The feeling of being watched, of being trapped, intensified, as though the house itself was aware of their every move, anticipating their next step. For a moment, the protagonist's mind broke from the onslaught of sensation, and they stood still, their gaze locked on the pedestal where the book had been. It was gone now, but in its place, there was a mirror. The reflection that stared back at them was not their own. It was a face they did not recognize, yet it was familiar, eyes hollow, mouth twisted into a grin that felt unnatural. The figure in the mirror moved independently of them, tilting its head slowly, almost mockingly. It was a reflection, yet it was not. It was as if the mirror had become a portal, showing them an image from another time, another life. As the protagonist stepped closer, their reflection seemed to move with them, its grin widening. It beckoned, drawing them in with an invisible force. The protagonist reached out, their hand trembling as they touched the cool surface of the mirror. The moment their skin made contact, a sharp pain shot through their arm, as if the mirror itself were alive, siphoning their energy. They yanked their hand back, but the reflection did not stop. Instead, the figure in the mirror laughed, a low, guttural sound that filled the cavern with an overwhelming sense of foreboding. Desperation crept in. The protagonist turned their head, eyes darting to the walls, which were now breathing, expanding and contracting like the lungs of some great beast. The darkness seemed to close in from all sides, like a tangible force squeezing the light from the room. The key pulsed in their hand, a final reminder of the inevitable, of the fate that had led them here. They had been chosen, and now they had to fulfill the purpose that had been set in motion centuries ago. The walls groaned, their creaks now resembling the sound of old bones snapping. The house was alive, its ancient heart pounding in sync with the protagonist's own. The floor beneath them shifted, and the passage that had once been narrow and claustrophobic widened into a vast chamber. The ceiling arched high above, the stonework intricate and ancient, covered in centuries of dust and decay. But it was not the architecture that caught the protagonist's attention. It was the altar in the center of the room. The altar was covered in remnants of long-forgotten rituals, dried blood, broken candles, strange markings etched into the stone surface. Surrounding the altar were the bones of past sacrifices, stacked high and arranged in eerie, intricate patterns. The protagonist's stomach churned at the sight, the weight of centuries of bloodshed bearing down on them. This was the heart of the house, the source of its dark power. They had come here to confront it, to face the truth, but the truth was more horrifying than they could have ever imagined. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just distant murmurs. They were commands, urging the protagonist forward. And in that moment, a horrifying realization struck them. They had been walking toward the altar for what seemed like ages, but the room was not growing closer. It was expanding, stretching to accommodate the growing force inside. The mansion was fed by the energy of its sacrifices, and the protagonist was meant to be its next offering. The walls pulsed again, this time with a sense of urgency. The house was preparing itself for the final rite, and the protagonist was the central figure in its ancient ritual. The realization sent a wave of terror through them, but it also sparked something else, a strange sense of acceptance. They were not the first to come here. They would not be the last. The mansion had claimed countless others before them, and it would claim countless more after. The protagonist was simply part of a long, unbroken chain, a cycle that had been set in motion long before they had arrived. The key burned once more, its heat now unbearable. The protagonist, trembling with fear and a sense of inevitability, placed the key on the altar. As they did, the room seemed to shudder, the walls groaning as if the mansion itself was coming alive, awakening to the ritual that had been set in motion. The key was the final piece, the final trigger. The moment the key touched the stone, the world around them fractured. Time, space, and reality all seemed to dissolve, leaving the protagonist in an endless void. The walls, the mirror, the altar, all were gone, and in the silence that followed, there was only one thought. They had finally become part of the house's legacy. There is a place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blur, a place where the past and future collide, and the present disappears into the void. This was the place the protagonist now found themselves trapped in, the core of the mansion's malevolent power. In this liminal space, time felt irrelevant, as though they had fallen into an abyss that had no beginning and no end. It was a descent, not into some earthly hell, but into the very soul of the mansion itself. The protagonist could feel the shift within them. It was not physical, but spiritual. Something deep within their consciousness had been unraveled, pulled apart like a fragile thread. They had once been a person, a stranger to the mansion's twisted history. But now, they were part of its curse. As they floated in this incomprehensible void, they could hear the echoes of past victims, trapped in this space for eternity, their souls long lost to the house's hunger. It wasn't just the sound that unsettled them. It was the absence of light, sound, and the very essence of being. A profound emptiness settled around the protagonist, as if the mansion had consumed not only their body, but their soul as well. There was nothing left of the world they had once known. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, all vanished, leaving them suspended in a vacuum where nothing could touch them, not even the passage of time. In the darkness, the protagonist could sense the house's heartbeat. It was faint at first, like a whisper from far away, but it grew stronger, more rhythmic, until it seemed to match the protagonist's own. The house lived and it thrived on its victims. It fed on the fear, the despair, and the agony that each soul brought with it. And now, the protagonist could feel their own essence being devoured, piece by piece. The house was claiming them, just as it had claimed so many before. The faint heartbeat turned into a cacophony of voices, whispering, wailing, laughing, each voice more distorted than the last. It was a chorus of the lost, the forgotten, those who had been swallowed whole by the mansion's insatiable hunger. Their voices tangled together in an incoherent mess, creating an overwhelming pressure in the protagonist's mind. It was too much, too many voices, too many emotions all vying for attention, pulling at the protagonist's sanity. The protagonist stumbled in the darkness, their bodies still feeling the lingering effects of the mansion's curse. They reached out, grasping for something, anything, to anchor them in this sea of endless void. And then they felt it, a presence. It was close, yet distant. It was the presence of someone or something that had been in this place far longer than they had. The very air seemed to thrum with energy, as if the mansion had chosen its newest prisoner. The figure appeared, not as a solid shape, but as a wisp of light in the distance. The light flickered and danced like a will-o'-the-wisp, drawing the protagonist's attention, pulling them toward it. Despite every ounce of instinct telling them to run, the protagonists found themselves walking toward it, their feet moving of their own accord. The closer they got, the clearer the figure became. It was the figure from the mirror, the distorted, grinning reflection that had first appeared in the room. It was not just a reflection anymore. It was alive and it was waiting. The figure was standing in the midst of a swirling vortex of shadow and light, its eyes locked onto the protagonist with an unsettling familiarity. It was a grin that held no joy, only an eerie, knowing satisfaction. It beckoned, its hands stretched out, inviting the protagonist to step closer. The air around them grew heavier, thick with an oppressive force that made it harder to breathe. But despite the terror that clawed at the protagonist's chest, they moved forward, helpless. As they crossed the threshold of the vortex, the environment shifted once again. The darkness gave way to an overgrown garden, an eerie reflection of the mansion's exterior. But this was not real. It was a projection, a memory. The garden was lush, yet decayed, the plants twisted and deformed, as though the house had stretched its influence even into the natural world. It was a place from the mansion's distant past, a place where the mansion had once been alive in ways the protagonist couldn't understand. The figure stood in the center of the garden, no longer just a shadow but a presence. It began to speak, its voice as smooth as silk but dripping with malice. "You've entered a place you were never meant to see," it said, its voice echoing in the protagonist's mind. "You think you can escape? You think you can free yourself from what you've become? The house has claimed you now, just as it has claimed all the others. And like them, you will never leave." The words were punctuated by the sound of distant, shrill laughter. The air around the protagonist thickened as the figure's grin widened. The protagonist wanted to scream, to run, but their body was no longer their own. Their mind was fraying at the edges, unraveling like a poorly woven tapestry. The mansion had woven its threads through every part of them, and now they were part of its cursed fabric. There was no escape. There was no salvation. The mansion's true nature had been revealed, and its grip was unbreakable. The protagonist had become yet another ghost in its endless halls, another lost soul to be consumed by the darkness. And yet, in the back of their mind, a flicker of resistance remained. It was faint, so faint it could barely be called a thought, but it was there. It was a small seed of defiance, a whisper of something the house could not yet consume. And it was enough. It was enough to keep the protagonist from giving in completely to the mansion's power. But it wasn't enough to free them. In the murky depths of the mansion's soul, the protagonist remained, lost and entangled in the web of the house's malevolent power. But something strange had begun to stir. A whisper, barely perceptible, echoed through the vast emptiness surrounding them. It was a voice, soft and fragile, like a distant memory struggling to break free from the clutches of time. The protagonist's consciousness, still reeling from the chaos of their surroundings, clung to it. Could it be a message? A sign? Something. Anything that could offer a glimmer of hope in this endless abyss? The whisper came again, this time more clearly. "You are not alone," it said, the voice a mixture of pain and longing. "There are others here, trapped just like you." The words seemed to cut through the oppressive darkness, like a thread pulled taut. They were words of comfort and warning at the same time, suggesting that the protagonist was not the mansion's first victim, nor perhaps its last. The presence of others, trapped in the mansion's malignant grip, only added to the growing tension. Who were they? And why had the mansion chosen to show the protagonist this now? As the voice faded into the air, the protagonist felt a strange compulsion, an instinct that drew them deeper into the mansion's core. There was something waiting for them, something just beyond the veil of the darkness. The protagonist's feet moved on their own, though their minds screamed for them to stop, to turn back, to fight. But the mansion had already sunk its claws deep into them, and the possibility of escape seemed as distant as the stars. It was then that the protagonist saw the flicker, a flicker of light that cut through the shadows like a beacon in the night. It was weak, yet undeniable. It was a source of illumination in the all-consuming darkness. The protagonist's mind grasped at it, pulling it closer, drawing them toward it like a moth to a flame. Each step toward the light felt like a battle, a fight between the need to break free and the paralyzing terror that gripped their very soul. The light grew stronger as the protagonist drew near, revealing a scene that seemed out of place in the heart of the mansion. It was a library, its towering shelves filled with ancient tomes, their leather-bound covers cracked and weathered with age. The room was vast, its high ceilings stretching out above, lost in the gloom. Yet, despite the eerie silence, it felt strangely comforting, as though the room had once been a sanctuary, an escape from the horrors of the outside world. But the books on the shelves were not ordinary. They pulsed with an otherworldly energy, as though they were alive, watching. At the far end of the room, a figure stood in the shadows, their form obscured by the dim light. The protagonist felt an inexplicable pull toward this figure, a sense of recognition, as though they had been waiting for this moment their entire life. The figure slowly turned to face them, their features hidden beneath the hood of a long, flowing cloak. Their presence was unnerving, yet oddly comforting, as if they embodied both the threat and the solution that the protagonist had been searching for. "Who are you?" the protagonist managed to whisper, their voice raw and weak. It felt foreign in their throat, as though they hadn't spoken in years. The figure did not immediately answer, instead stepping closer, their movements fluid and purposeful. The air around them seemed to shimmer, distorting reality itself, as if the figure existed in a realm just beyond comprehension. "I am the keeper of the house," the figure said, their voice low and commanding. "I have been here for longer than you can imagine, trapped by the same curse that binds you. But I have learned how to fight it." The words sent a shiver down the protagonist's spine. This figure, the keeper of the house, was more than just a spectral entity. They were a survivor, someone who had been through the horrors of the mansion's grip and had found a way to endure. Yet, the question remained, could they truly break free? Could the protagonist escape the mansion's insidious hold? Or had they already become another part of its eternal nightmare? The keeper continued, their voice growing more urgent. "There's a way out," they said, stepping closer still. "But it comes at a price. You must face the house's true nature, its deepest, darkest secret. And in doing so, you will risk losing everything you know, everything you are. There is no guarantee of survival, but there is a chance." A cold sweat broke out on the protagonist's skin. The thought of facing the house's true nature was enough to send a wave of dread crashing over them. The mansion had already taken so much, their mind, their identity, their very sense of being. What more could they lose? But the flicker of hope, the possibility of escape, was too strong to ignore. Despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm them, the protagonist had no choice but to follow this path, however uncertain it might be. The keeper's eyes, pale and unblinking, seemed to bore into the protagonist's soul. "You have already taken the first step," they said. "The mansion has marked you. Now, you must decide, will you fight, or will you become part of the house's endless hunger? The choice is yours, but know this. Once you begin this journey, there is no turning back." The protagonist's heart raced. There was no turning back. The mansion had already claimed them, and now, it seemed that the only way out was to face the unimaginable horrors that lurked within its walls. But in that moment, as the keeper's cryptic words hung in the air, the protagonist felt something they hadn't felt in what seemed like forever, a surge of determination. It was faint, but it was real. There was a way out, and somehow they were going to find it. The protagonist, standing face to face with the keeper of the house, felt the weight of the decision that loomed before them. The keeper's cryptic words echoed in their mind. "Once you begin this journey, there is no turning back." The thought of facing the mansion's true nature filled the protagonist with a sense of both dread and resolve. There was a path ahead, a path toward escape, but it was unclear whether they were walking toward salvation or into an even darker nightmare. The library, with its towering shelves and pulsating books, seemed to close in around them, as if the walls themselves were breathing. The room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The flickering light that had drawn the protagonist here wavered, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Despite the sense of unease that gripped them, the protagonist's mind could not ignore the pull of the keeper's words. There was a chance, no matter how slim, of breaking free from the mansion's insidious grip. And that was enough to fuel their next steps. The keeper's gaze was unwavering, as if they were waiting for the protagonist to make a choice. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier, suffocating almost, and the protagonist could feel their breath growing shallow, as though the very air had been thickened with the mansion's malignant power. The urgency was palpable now. There was no time to waste. The figure of the keeper, standing in the center of the library, seemed to emanate both authority and desperation, as though their own soul had been tethered to this place for far too long. "You must understand," the keeper began again, their voice steady but tinged with the weight of ancient knowledge, "that the house is not just a structure. It is a living, breathing entity. Its hunger is insatiable, and it feeds on the souls of those who enter. But its true nature is far more complex. The house is not simply a trap. It is a prison, a reflection of its own twisted creation." The protagonist struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the keeper's words. The mansion a prison? A reflection of its own twisted creation? How could something so monstrous be a product of its own design? Was it a sentient being capable of thought and emotion? Or was it merely an inanimate object imbued with a malevolent force? The protagonist's mind raced, seeking answers that only seemed to slip further from their grasp. "The house was built on a foundation of corruption," the keeper continued, "a curse that was woven into its very walls, a curse that has taken on a life of its own. It began with the greed and ambition of those who built it. They sought to create something magnificent, but in doing so, they tapped into something far darker, something that is fed on their ambitions, their guilt, and their fear. The mansion has evolved, fed by the souls it consumes." The words were a revelation, yet they only deepened the protagonist's confusion. What was the keeper saying? That the mansion's malevolent energy was not a natural force, but something born of the very human desires that had once sought to shape it? The house was the manifestation of greed, ambition, and guilt, a distorted reflection of the very souls who had built it. It was as if the mansion had become a mirror, reflecting back the darkness of those who dared to shape it. "There is one thing you must understand," the keeper said, their voice quieter now, almost as if sharing a secret. "The house is not just feeding on souls. It is also trying to replicate them. It is trying to recreate the very essence of humanity, using the souls it consumes to craft something new, something unnatural." The mention of replication, of something being created from the souls of the lost, sent a cold shiver through the protagonist. The idea that the mansion was not just a prison, but an entity trying to recreate human souls, twist them, distort them into something else entirely, was too horrific to fully grasp. It was a thought that threatened to undo everything the protagonist thought they understood about the world, about life and death. "What do you mean?" the protagonist asked, their voice barely a whisper, as though the words themselves might be too much to bear. The keeper's expression seemed to soften, as though they were preparing to divulge the final piece of the puzzle. "The souls the house has claimed," the keeper began, "are not simply lost. They are used, shaped into something else. They become part of the house itself, not in the way you might think. They become echoes, shadows of what they once were. They are not dead, but they are no longer truly alive. And they are bound to the mansion, just as I am." The keeper's words struck the protagonist like a blow to the chest. The souls trapped within the mansion were not simply lost. They were transformed, bound to the house in a way that made escape impossible. The house did not just consume its victims. It twisted their very essence into something unrecognizable. The protagonist was not dealing with an ordinary haunted house. They were facing a force that recreated those it consumed, binding them to its will, keeping them trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. "This is what you must face," the keeper said, stepping back slightly. If you are to escape, you must confront the house's darkest secret, the souls it has absorbed and transformed. They are the key. They're the ones who can either break the curse or bind you to it forever. The air around the protagonist grew colder as the weight of the keeper's words settled in. The implications were overwhelming. To break free, to escape this nightmare, they would have to confront the very essence of the house, those souls that had been trapped and twisted by its malevolent power. But how could they hope to undo what had already been done? And if they failed, what would become of them? Would they, too, become an echo, a shadow of their former self, forever bound to the mansion's hunger? In that moment, as the protagonist's mind grappled with the staggering truth, the mansion seemed to groan in response, its walls shifting, its pulse quickening. It was alive, and it was waiting. The revelation of the mansion's true nature lingered in the protagonist's mind like an unshakable weight, pressing down with the realization that their escape was no longer just a matter of physical endurance, but a battle against the very soul of the house itself. The keeper's words echoed incessantly, growing louder with every passing second. The souls are the key. They are the ones who can either break the curse or bind you to it forever. This truth was a daunting one. The mansion, far from being a mere haunted building, had become a living, breathing entity, fed by its victims and seeking to recreate them into something new, something unnatural. The question that now lingered was simple but harrowing. How could the protagonist confront these transformed souls, shadows of their former selves, without becoming just another one of them? Was there any possibility of redemption or escape, or was this journey bound to end in inevitable tragedy? The once comforting familiarity of the mansion now felt more like a labyrinth, its walls shifting with an unknown intention, its rooms restructuring themselves with a life of their own. Even as the protagonist felt the urgency to act, the overwhelming force of the house seemed to mock their every step. As the protagonist moved cautiously through the mansion, the overwhelming presence of the house, its cold, oppressive atmosphere, became suffocating. It was as though the mansion was watching, anticipating each decision, each movement. The unsettling silence that permeated every inch of the space was no longer just a void. It was a presence, one that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the protagonist's own heart. Every corner, every shadow held the potential to reveal something horrifying. The mansion was not simply haunting them. It was engaging them in a twisted game, forcing them to confront their deepest fears and desires. Each room they entered felt both alien and familiar, as though the very structure of the house was warping in response to their thoughts and actions. The once grand ballroom, now covered in dust and decay, seemed to shift its boundaries the longer they stood inside. The chandeliers overhead appeared to glimmer with an eerie, almost malevolent light, casting distorted reflections that flickered and changed shape with every glance. The portraits that lined the walls, once silent witnesses to the mansion's faded grandeur, now seemed to stare back at them, their eyes tracking the protagonist's every movement. It was in this environment, a world of ever-changing illusions, that the protagonist realized just how far the mansion's grip extended. It was not simply a physical structure, but a reflection of the darkness and despair that had been entombed within it. The mansion had become a mirror, an echo of the twisted souls trapped within, each room a physical manifestation of the fear, guilt, and torment that defined those who had become part of its malevolent design. To leave now, to simply run, would mean giving in to the corruption that had already begun to seep into their very soul. The house would claim them as it had claimed so many others, turning them into yet another shadow, a distorted reflection of their former self. The protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by a strange whisper, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing moment. They could feel the presence behind them, the sensation that they were being watched, that something was drawing closer. The air thickened, became tangible, as though it were charged with an energy that was both alive and malicious. The voice, now more distinct, called out from the shadows, its words indistinguishable at first, but slowly forming into coherent phrases. "It is too late for you," the voice crooned, its tone dripping with mockery. "The house has already claimed your soul. There is no escape from its embrace. You are already part of us." The protagonist's pulse quickened. Was this another twisted manifestation of the mansion's hunger? Or was it one of the trapped souls, now distorted beyond recognition, reaching out from the shadows? The thought was enough to paralyze them for a moment, but they quickly recovered, pushing forward despite the overwhelming sense of dread. The mansion itself seemed to respond, its walls creaking and groaning as if it were alive, stretching and reshaping to hold them in its suffocating grip. The protagonist could feel the air growing colder with each step, and the whispering voice continued to taunt them, now surrounding them from every direction. The very fabric of reality seemed to warp and bend, the floor beneath them shifting as if alive, threatening to pull them under. With a sharp, desperate intake of breath, the protagonist forced their body to move forward. They had no choice now. The only way out was through. But as they ventured deeper into the mansion, the weight of the keeper's words became more and more evident. The house was feeding on them, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. Each room, each turn seemed to test them, to push them further into the labyrinth of their own mind. They had to confront the house's dark secret, the souls it had consumed, and the twisted horrors that had been born from those very souls. As the protagonists made their way through the winding corridors, they finally arrived at the central hall, the place that had been the focus of their dreams, the one area that seemed to have been drawing them in from the beginning. But as they stepped into the hall, they realized with a jolt that they were not alone. The walls, once covered in portraits, were now adorned with distorted faces, the eyes wide and pleading. Their mouths were open, as though they were screaming, but no sound came forth. They were all staring directly at the protagonist, as if waiting for something. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sensation of being watched intensified to an unbearable degree. The protagonist knew, with a chilling certainty, that the final confrontation was upon them. The mansion had drawn them here, to this very place, for a reason. But what was that reason? Was this the beginning of their end? Or had they finally uncovered the truth that could set them free? The journey to uncover the mansion's dark secret was far from over, but the protagonist had no choice but to move forward. The shadows were stirring, and with them, the souls trapped within the mansion. Each step they took would lead them deeper into the heart of the house, and perhaps into the heart of their own terror. The walls of the mansion had, at long last, revealed their secrets. The protagonist stood before the central hall, the beating heart of the house itself. The very air seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if the mansion were alive, breathing in sync with the movements of the protagonist. The silence had taken on a suffocating quality, pressing down with the weight of centuries, filling every corner with a heavy, oppressive force. This was no longer a place of human existence. It had transcended that. What had once been a grand home was now a prison, its inhabitants long since absorbed into the very fabric of its existence. The faces and the portraits on the walls were no longer silent. They had changed. Their eyes now followed every movement, their mouths twisted in silent screams. The faces were distorted, as if in the throes of agony or madness, their features warped by years of torment. They were not merely depictions. They were vessels, holding the echoes of those who had once lived here, now reduced to nothing more than specters of their former selves. These were the souls the mansion had consumed, drawn into its grasp, now part of its dark machinery. Their cries, though unheard, reverberated in the very air, filling the protagonist with an intense dread that seemed to suffocate every rational thought. It was clear now, this place had not been haunted in the traditional sense. This was no mere curse or supernatural anomaly. The mansion itself had become a creature, a predator, its walls and halls designed to trap and consume. Its hunger was not for mere life. It craved souls, their essence, their very being. It had twisted its inhabitants into eternal suffering, using their pain to fuel its malevolent force. Every room, every shadow, Every crack in the walls seemed to hold a piece of their misery. The mansion had evolved beyond its original purpose, growing and mutating to fit the needs of its insatiable hunger. But it was not only the souls of the past that the mansion sought. The protagonist had come to understand that they were part of the equation, a vital component in the cycle the mansion had established. They were not just an innocent bystander. The mansion had chosen them, drawn them here with a purpose. They were a part of the plan, their arrival not a coincidence, but a calculated move in the grand design. To leave now would mean falling victim to the mansion's twisted desires, becoming another shadow, another face on the wall. But the truth was not so easily accepted. The mind recoiled at the very possibility that they were no different from those who had come before them, entrapped, consumed, and twisted beyond recognition. As the protagonist stepped further into the hall, the air grew colder still. The temperature dropped with every footfall, as if the very space was reacting to their presence. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing the available space, trapping the protagonist in an ever-decreasing circle of confinement. The sensation of being watched intensified, the oppressive silence now broken by the softest of whispers, voices that seemed to rise from the very stone beneath their feet. These whispers were not the voices of the living, but of the lost souls, the damned, whose presence permeated every inch of the mansion. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more distinct, until the protagonist could hear them clearly. They were not only speaking to each other, but to the protagonist, each whisper a thread pulling them closer to the truth of the mansion's origins. "You are not the first," one voice murmured, "and you will not be the last." Another followed with, "We were all chosen, just as you have been. The mansion knows you. It sees you. It wants you." These voices, no longer distant murmurs, now felt like an inevitable chorus of the damned, pushing the protagonist toward an understanding that threatened to break their mind. The protagonist stopped in the center of the hall, trying to steady their breathing as the reality of their situation set in. Escape was not possible, not in the way they had hoped. There would be no grand finale where they could simply walk out, triumphant, escaping the mansion's grip. To leave now would mean to accept their place within its cursed walls, to surrender to the cycle that had already ensnared so many before them. It was not just the house that was hungry. It was the souls of the past, reaching out from the shadows, begging for a release they could never achieve. And yet, amid the overwhelming darkness, there was something else, a glimmer, a flicker of hope. The protagonist had learned enough to realize that the mansion's power was not absolute. It thrived on fear, on confusion, on the despair of those who had walked its halls before them. The key to breaking free lay not in fighting the mansion directly, but in understanding it, in facing the truth it sought to conceal. The mansion had been built by a twisted mind, someone who had sought to bind the souls of its inhabitants to its very foundation, turning the mansion into a repository for the suffering of countless lives. In that moment of clarity, the protagonist understood that they were not just a victim, nor merely a player in the mansion's twisted game. They were something more. The mansion had chosen them, yes, but it had also underestimated their resilience, their will to survive. The very power it sought to wield over them was the same power that could be used against it. Fear, the mansion's greatest weapon, could be turned to their advantage. It was a twisted paradox, but it was a truth they could use to their benefit. With this understanding came a renewed sense of purpose. The protagonist had no illusions. They were still trapped, still a part of the mansion's dark cycle. But they were no longer passive. The house could no longer hold the same sway over them. Every step they had taken had led them closer to this moment. The realization that the mansion was not invincible, that it could be outwitted, defeated, or perhaps even destroyed. The mansion was not an unyielding force of nature. It was a creation, and like all creations, it had a vulnerable core. The protagonist could not stay in the hall forever, surrounded by the tormented faces and the suffocating whispers. It was time to confront the final piece of the puzzle, the source of the mansion's dark power. But first, they would need to face the heart of the house, the place where the curse had originated. Only there, in the depths of the mansion, Could they hope to find the key to ending the nightmare once and for all? The mansion had waited for them to come this far, to reach this understanding. Now it would have to reckon with the consequences of its creation. As the protagonist descended into the heart of the mansion, a sense of finality washed over them. The walls, which had once seemed imposing and filled with whispers of the damned, now appeared to be shrinking. The journey they had undertaken had led them to this point. The culmination of every twist, every turn, every choice that had brought them deeper into the mansion's dark and twisted bowels. Here, in the belly of this accursed place, they would face the truth of its existence. And more importantly, they would come face to face with the creature it had become. The heart of the mansion was not a room, nor a hallway, but a central chamber that pulsed with an eerie, unnatural glow. The very air here felt thick, heavy with a presence that could not be ignored. It was as if the mansion had breathed out its own life force, and it exhaled into the room, enveloping the protagonist in its suffocating embrace. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and contorting in impossible ways, as if the room itself was alive and reacting to the intrusion. The air felt alive, oppressive, with a tension that hung thick between every breath. It was clear now that the mansion was not just a place. It was a sentience, a force that had existed long before the first brick was laid. The mansion had not simply consumed its inhabitants. It had evolved with every life it claimed, growing stronger, more cunning, and more dangerous. Every soul it trapped only served to deepen its hunger, to fuel the malevolent intelligence that guided its actions. The rooms, the walls, the very foundation of the mansion had all been designed with a singular purpose: to bind, to consume, to trap. But the protagonist had arrived at the heart of this monstrosity, and they felt something different in the air. The presence of the mansion's power, though overwhelming, had shifted. It was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. There was a crack in the foundation, a weakness that could be exploited. The mansion had underestimated their resilience, their ability to adapt and fight back. What had once been an impenetrable fortress of suffering was now a sickly shell, an edifice that had already started to rot from within. At the center of the room lay the source of the mansion's twisted power, a crimson-red altar, its surface slick with an oily sheen that reflected the dim light. Around it, the walls of the chamber were adorned with bizarre symbols, markings that seemed to be shifting, moving, as though alive. These were not the typical runes of old, but symbols born of madness, of an intelligence that had long ago abandoned any human understanding. They were the blueprints of a twisted design, a map to a reality warped by suffering and darkness. And there, atop the altar, lay a vessel, a body, or what had once been a body. It was barely human, its features contorted and malformed, as if it had been twisted by years of unimaginable torment. The figure was bound to the altar, its arms and legs splayed in unnatural angles, its face frozen in a grimace of agony. Its eyes, however, were wide open, empty, hollow, yet somehow filled with a recognition that sent a chill down the protagonist's spine. This was the source of the mansion's power. The very soul of the mansion was contained in this abomination. It was not merely a structure that consumed, but a creature, a being that had become both the mansion and its prisoner, a symbiotic existence formed out of suffering. The protagonist felt a surge of revulsion and terror, but also an undeniable understanding. This creature, this thing, had once been human. It had been the architect of the mansion, the one who had designed its twisted framework, the one who had allowed the darkness to consume everything it touched. But it was no longer human. It had become something far worse, a parasitic entity, feeding on the very souls it had captured, growing stronger with every life it claimed. And yet, for all its power, it was still bound to the altar, still trapped in its own creation. The realization hit with the force of a sledgehammer. The mansion was not invincible, but it was self-perpetuating. As long as the creature remained alive, as long as it remained bound to the altar, the mansion would continue to thrive, to grow, to consume. The cycle would never end. The protagonist had come this far. And now they had to make the ultimate decision: destroy the creature and end the mansion's reign of terror, or let it continue, knowing that countless more souls would be trapped, consumed, and twisted by its insatiable hunger. The choice was not an easy one. The protagonist had seen the horror, the madness that the mansion had unleashed, and they had felt the weight of the souls that had been lost within its walls. To destroy the creature meant to end the suffering of those trapped within it. But it also meant erasing the last remnants of a being that had once been human, relinquishing the last trace of empathy that had once existed in the mansion. The protagonist stood there, wrestling with the moral dilemma, knowing that whatever choice they made would seal their fate. And then, as if sensing the protagonist's hesitation, the creature began to move. Slowly, painfully, it stirred on the altar, its eyes locking with the protagonist's. The air crackled with energy, as if the very walls of the room were vibrating with the intensity of the moment. The creature's lips twitched into a semblance of a smile, a distorted, cruel expression, and a low, guttural voice filled the room. "You have come so far, but you cannot stop what has already begun," it hissed. "The mansion will not allow it. You will become part of it, just as all who came before you have." The room seemed to tremble at the words, as if the mansion itself were alive, reacting to the threat of its destruction. The protagonist knew now that the mansion had not simply been a building. It was a living, breathing entity that would fight to preserve itself. The creature was not just the architect, it was the heart of the mansion. And if the protagonist was to escape, to destroy the mansion once and for all, they would have to face the creature directly, to face the very essence of the darkness that had consumed everything in its path. The final confrontation was at hand, and the protagonist knew that only one could walk away from this battle: the mansion or them. The confrontation was inevitable. After the chilling revelation in the previous chapter, the protagonist stood on the precipice of their own fate. The creature, bound to the altar, its grotesque form twisting in ways that defied nature, was not just a mere adversary. It was the embodiment of the mansion itself, its very heart, its soul. To destroy, it was to tear apart the mansion, to end a cycle of suffering that had stretched beyond time and reason. But the price for such an act was steep. Nothing less than the erasure of all that the mansion had become, including the echoes of those lost souls that still lingered within its walls. The air in the chamber was thick with tension, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath, waiting for the final act to unfold. Shadows, once dancing playfully on the walls, now seemed to close in, as if the darkness itself were preparing to smother any light that dared to exist. The protagonist's heart pounded in their chest, each beat a reminder of the weight of their decision. The mansion was more than a place. It had become a living thing, and like any creature, it would fight tooth and nail to survive. The creature's voice rang out again, its tone full of mockery and despair. "You think you can stop me? You think you can sever the ties that bind me to this place?" Its laughter echoed through the chamber, bouncing off the walls in a maddening cacophony. "I'm the mansion, and you," it paused, as if savoring the moment. "You are nothing but a fleeting thought, a dream, a whisper in the wind." But the protagonist remained resolute. Fear had been a constant companion throughout their journey, but it no longer had a hold on them. What they had discovered in the mansion, the suffering, the torment, the souls trapped within its walls, had driven them to this moment. It wasn't just a battle for survival anymore. It was a fight for freedom, not just for themselves, but for all those who had suffered and died in this wretched place. The mansion had consumed their lives, but it would not consume their legacy. Drawing a deep breath, the protagonist reached for the object they had brought, the key to the mansion's destruction, a simple yet powerful artifact that had been hinted at in earlier visions, whispered about by the spirits they had encountered. It was a small vial, its contents glowing with an otherworldly light. The vial held the power to sever the bond between the creature and the mansion, to destroy the heart of the evil that had taken root here. It was a tool of unimaginable power, capable of undoing all the horrors the mansion had wrought. With trembling hands, the protagonist raised the vial high. The creature's eyes widened in recognition, but it was too late. The air crackled with energy as the darkness that had once been impenetrable began to wane, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. The walls trembled, as if the very bones of the mansion were protesting, desperate to hold on to the life they had nourished for so long. But the protagonist, unwavering, poured the contents of the vial onto the altar. The moment the liquid touched the altar, the room exploded in a blinding flash of light. For a split second, the protagonist thought they had been struck blind, but then the light receded, leaving only a vast, suffocating silence. The mansion seemed to have stopped breathing. The creature, once so full of malevolent energy, lay still, its twisted form frozen in place, its eyes wide and empty. The darkness that had suffused the room began to fade, the very essence of the mansion's evil dissipating as if it had never existed at all. It was over, but as the protagonist gazed at the altar, they saw something unexpected. The mansion was not crumbling, not falling apart. Instead, it was changing. The walls, once covered in symbols of dread, began to soften, to lose their grotesque edge. The strange markings on the floor, the runes that had whispered promises of torment, started to fade away, dissolving into nothingness. It was as if the mansion, once a prison, was now being freed, its very existence purged of the darkness that had consumed it. The protagonist felt a strange sense of peace wash over them, but it was a peace that came with the understanding of what had been sacrificed. The mansion, though now cleansed, was not without its scars. It was no longer the malevolent entity it had been, but its history, its legacy, remained a reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. The souls of those who had been trapped here were now free, but the memories of their suffering would never be erased. The mansion stood before the protagonist, no longer a place of fear, but a hollow shell of what it had been. And yet, in that hollow, there was the faintest glimmer of something new. Hope. The mansion had been a symbol of despair, a living nightmare that consumed everything in its path. But now, in the aftermath of the protagonist's actions, it could become something else, a place of renewal, a testament to the resilience of those who had fought back against the darkness. But the protagonist also knew that this was not the end. As the mansion began to crumble, the last remnants of its power slipping away, they couldn't help but wonder, what other places in the world carried this kind of evil, this kind of history? What other places were waiting to be freed from the shadows? In that moment, standing amidst the wreckage of the mansion, the protagonist understood that their journey had not been one of simple survival, but of transformation. They had not just defeated the creature. They had taken the first step toward breaking the cycle, toward ending the reign of terror that had stretched far beyond the confines of this one building. The mansion was gone, but the lesson it had taught them would never fade. Darkness could be defeated, but it would always find new forms, new places to take root. It was a battle that would never truly end. And yet, the protagonist walked away from the mansion, free at last. Their journey was far from over, but they had proven that even the darkest forces could be challenged, and that hope, though fragile, could rise from the ashes.